Okay guys, so in this video we are going to have a look at the sidebar and how we've implemented our sidebar. So let's have a look at that. So as you can see now, I've added some styling and some elements to the sidebar, and basically we can't in order for us to be able to do all of this in just completely vanilla JavaScript and no third-party dependencies or anything like that. It's the icons are not perfect. I basically just using HTML elements to do this, which are supported in most of the browsers. So there will be a little bit of a deviation there, but I think we can survive that. So if I click these different tabs now, you can see that they are actually highlighting in the correct way, and I have just added some event listeners to, well, not event listeners, but alerts to the actual interactions, because that's out of scope for right now. We're going to have a look at that later, where we'll actually show the different modals and the things that are actually going to happen when we click around here. But I want to start us out by just getting like the visual components in place, and I don't really have to implement these things, because as long as I know that this event is firing, I know that we can hook into that and then show the modals and all that good stuff later when we actually connect all of this to the server, right? So let's have a look at the code. So the first thing that's changed is that our main file, which is the entry point into our application, has changed. So it's no longer just printing out foo, it's actually requiring the sidebar component. And the sidebar component is this component here, or actually no, it's actually not. The sidebar component is this directory here. So you can see that there's quite a few things that is going on here, because basically what we've had to do here is to have a little bit of a think about how do we want to actually create these elements, because the elements that are on the page, they can't just be there at server, like at render time. So when the server is rendering, sending out our document, because the nature of this application is actually a very good fit for an SPA application or a single page application, because when you're actually clicking around in Slack like this, you're actually just moving about on the same page like this, like you're just reloading this content. You see that there's no page refresh or anything like that. So in order for us to do that, we are going to have to figure out a way to just create like JavaScript elements and have them update according to different interactions that the user have. And that is one of the main reasons why people use React and Angular and Ember and Vue and so forth, because of the complexity that actually comes with this sort of application. But since our goal is to do this without such a framework, we've had to go a little bit old school. So this approach that we're going to have is that basically we're going to have a split. We were going to have components that are actually there at render time, or at when the actual file is being loaded, or the index, like the HTML file, is actually coming to the user. So as you can see here, we have this little body area here, which is our sidebar, and I've added in the different classes, like basically you see the FLAC or the H1 that is at the top of this page right here. That's here, and I've added also like placeholders for the different sections. So you see that the channels section here is actually already there, which is this section here, and the button is also there, and you can see that we have a few things going on here. Well, actually, let's take a bit of a closer look at this, because I think that can be kind of interesting. So the way that it works is that we have to ask the fundamental question: is this component always going to be the same component, and is it always going to be in the same state when the user loads the application? If the answer to that question is yes, then it should ideally be part of the DOM, like the actual HTML document that you send to the browser or to the client. And these two sections, I mean, they're never going to change. It's always going to be the same text, and they only have a button, and all I really need to do here is to have a way of hooking into that button. And the way I like to do that is with custom attributes. So I do something like this, data-js, and then I call it channels. The reason why I want to do that is because now I have expressed to the person who's reading this document that, hey, this thing here actually has a dependency in JavaScript land. If you just use an ID, there's no connection there. I mean, this could just be an arbitrary ID, it could just be something for CSS, who knows. But if you do this, you're very explicit and you say, this is something you need to look into. There's JavaScript that needs this element on the page. And that's actually exactly how it works. So if we have a look back at this file here, we see here that I actually am querying the DOM for these different components that I need in order to do, like, execute the logic that I need. And for the buttons, I've basically just put some placeholders here so that we create an alert when we click something, as you saw earlier. And then we have this little section here where we have some fake data right now, which is, as you may recognize, the channel names, these channels here. It's just something we're going to keep in memory, but we're of course later on going to be actually get this information from the server. And then we have this component here which we call a channel list that takes in an object with all our channels, and then we put a instance of this channel list on the window object. I will explain why in just a moment. And then we have this magical little function that is called create element that's going to spit out a channel node, and the same thing goes for the direct message or the direct messages list. And then finally we go and grab the channel list and we grab the parent node of that channel list, and in order to be able to replace the node that is actually there on the page. So basically what we're going to do is that we're going to grab the channel list, that element, and we're going to replace it. That's basically all that's going to happen here. So as you can see here, we're like this channel list here, all we're doing is that we're grabbing that DOM element that's there at render time, and then we're just replacing it with our, with the component that we have created using JavaScript. And the same thing goes for the direct messages list. And that's really all there is to it. The reason why we want to expose things on the window object will hopefully become a little bit clearer once we go through the more complicated part of all of this, which is the actual framework. So the way that the framework, or the way that I have structured this, is a little bit, it's very similar to how I've been doing this traditionally, and up until recently this hasn't been something that I haven't had the same way of doing. Like, this way is, I think, more in line with the way that people are more accustomed to working with components and so forth, and I wanted to try this out, but I've never had a reason to do it professionally, because most companies use SBA frameworks. But this is very similar to how I used to do it before we actually had that, and how I build things when I do these things in complete vanilla JavaScript, with a few minor tweaks. But let's just walk through it. So the idea of a component is hopefully very familiar to you, where you have a visual component of some sort, and in order for us to be able to create, say, a channels list like this, what we do is that we create this component class, or this component instance, that we can now extend, and then we can bootstrap some logic to this, and it has a bit of an interface. Now the reason why we want to do it this way is because we need some way of communicating between the render, the create element function, and the component itself. In other words, this is a very natural fit for an object-oriented solution, because we really want to be able to declare different methods or lifecycle events or whatever on our components, so that we can actually call these components as part of our rendering process. So if we have a look at this little, let's see here. If we have a look at this component, this is very similar to some of the concepts that you will see in React, with a few differences. So we declare a refs object, which is going to store references, if we need them, to the actual DOM elements that our component is going to hold, because we're going to render basically a node of DOM elements, or like tags and whatever. And it's very useful for us, and you will see that in just a moment, where we want to be able to actually, once we've created these elements, we want to keep a reference to these elements, so that the component can actually update these references. Because the way that in React land, for example, things would work is that you re-render the whole DOM tree every single time, and to be honest, that is something that is way more complicated than, well, it's not feasible. In order for us to do that effectively, we would have to be well, basically the React team. And I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not the React team. I'm just one single person. So what I like to do is to keep things simple. And I'll show you in just a moment how this actually is going to work. And this actually does work pretty well as well. So then we have our state, so that we can actually store local state, and then we have our props, which is going to be passed in if we actually want to pass in properties to the component from a nested component or a higher component. And then we have the concept of children. We'll look at that in just a moment. And then we have something called dispatch, which is connected to the store. And the store in this scenario is, well, let's think of it as the glue that connects all the components and the state of our application together. It's very similar to a concept, if you're familiar, you might be familiar with Redux or other state management tools like that. But since I promised I wouldn't do it with any type of like no fanciness, no SPA, no nothing, I've actually implemented this from scratch the way that I have done this before. I actually used Redux for this sort of stuff. And then we have something called setChild, which will hopefully make sense in just a moment. And then we have something called setReducer, and then setSubscriber. So the methods that we expose on our component is get store state, so that we can actually see what the state of our application is. If we go to our browser, and we have a little bit of a look here, and we say state like this, and then we do sidebar, we'll notice that we actually have the selected state here. And if I click here and I do that again, we'll see that the state is actually being updated. And this is the thing that trips up a lot of people when they work with just vanilla JavaScript. So in order for you to effectively be able to maintain a large JavaScript codebase in all vanilla JavaScript, it is vital that you have some way of connecting all the components, because if I'm clicking one thing in one part of the application and I need to communicate to another part of the application, it's very important that you can dispatch messages between the different components so that you can inform each component that, hey, the state changed, you need to update yourself, because you're not actually re-rendering the whole DOM tree as we do in React. You're actually just updating an existing component, which hopefully will make sense in just a moment. So basically that's how we can get the initial, like we can just grab the state whenever we need it. And then we have something called setReducer, where we simply go to the store and we namespace a reducer. So we have declared a reducer. We can actually look at that here. Let's see here, direct messages. No, we actually did that in the main file here. So you saw this here. We set the reducer called sidebar, and then we have a sidebar reducer and some kind of init state. And the init state is basically just this selected channel. That's all it is. So what we've done here is that you can see here, sidebar is actually something that is on our state. And that's where that is coming from. So this is basically us declaring a reducer of some sort. And we'll look at the reducer in just a moment, but basically that's this function. And then we have a subscriber, where you can declare the same thing. We can say that, hey, I am a subscriber with this name, and this is my function, which is just a subscriber function that is going to be called. We will look at how the store works as well, so this hopefully makes sense to you. And then we have the concept of setting a child, where we give a name and a child element, or a child component, and then we create that element and set it on the children's object on our component. So let's go and have a look how a component actually looks. So the way we do this is, okay, we declare a channels list, we extend our component, and in our constructor we simply pass in the props and give them to our component, and that's just going to be our props now. And then we bind our different functions that we need in order to do whatever it is that we want to do. So we have render list item, on event, and load channel, and then we have set subscriber. So what I've done now is that I have declared that I am a subscriber, that this component is a subscriber of the event channel. And the event channel is basically when the store is going to dispatch different events. So if we have a look at, let's have a look at the actual store. This is where things might get a little bit more complicated. So the store is going to have a state, a bunch of reducers, and a few subscribers, and then expose these set reducer, set subscriber, and dispatch, so that we can actually dispatch messages. So set reducer and set subscriber is very similar, as you can see here, where we have some type of we pass in an initial state and we set a reducer with that name of some sort, and the same thing goes for subscriber. And then we do, whenever somebody calls a dispatch with an action, in other words, we want to allow components to dispatch an action that contains some type of information, and we want everybody who is subscribing to these events or to this message bus, if you will, this message channel, to be able to be informed that, hey, this thing actually happened now. I hope you're ready for it. And so what we do is that we create a state. We grab all the reducer names and then we loop through all of the reducers that have been allocated with set reducer, and then we do this. We just grab this current state of the current reducer, and then we pass that in. So we grab the reducer with the name. So in this case, it's going to be sidebar, and then that's going to be a function, which is just a function that the reducer is going to expect. And then we pass in the current state and our action, and that's going to produce the new state. So and basically all we do is to do that for every single component. So we just go through all the components that have registered a reducer, give them the current state and the action that was dispatched, and allow them to return us the new state, so that we can actually just synchronously update all of these different components, or at least mutate the state in the way that each component wants to mutate it. So the rule here is that each reducer needs to return, it takes in a state and it has to return a state that is in the same shape. It can be updated, but it has to be in the same shape, otherwise this will break. And then basically all we do is that we copy over the current state with the new state, and we put that, well, that now becomes the new state. And that's about it, really. So that's how we can make these updates. We might tweak this later on, but for now this seems to work very well for us. And then we grab our subscribers, and then we do a very similar thing where we simply go and we grab the onEvent function, and then we just check if there is an onEvent registered, and then we simply call the onEvent with the state and the action. And the reason why we want to separate this is because we want to be able to both express this is you want to be able to register a reducer for changing the state, but you also want a component that doesn't necessarily need to have its own reducer, but it needs to be informed about that there was a state change. So as you can see here for the channels list, for example, the channels list doesn't have its own reducer because it doesn't need to hold its own state, but what it does need is to know when the state actually changed, and that's where this onEvent thing comes into play. So, and then finally here as well, we just kind of on the index.js file in the store, we simply initially instantiate one store, and then we expose that here. This is just a convenience thing I do so that I can debug any issues that I have with the state, and then I just export the store. And as we could see here earlier, all the stores, let's see here, it was here, right? So as you can see here, this is this instance of the store that we simply provide to each component, so that it has a bit of convenience. But you can also just grab the store directly and use it as we did here, where we're just directly grabbing it without the component, right? Cool. So that's the onEvent. So what basically happens here is that the onEvent will be called once the state has been updated by all the components. And then we will simply check if the type of this event is going to be this that a selected channel was set selected channel. So that this channel has been selected, right? So now we want to grab all of our references, and we want to loop through all of our references, and we want to remove the classes that indicate that this component is in a certain state. So sidebar li and sidebar li selected is going to be removed, and then we're just going to reset everything back to the original state. So remove this, and we add back just this CSS class here, which is going to make things look, like normal, basically, without the selected state. Cool. Then we have this thing called load channel here, which is going to be called whenever you interact with something. We'll touch on this in just a moment, but the idea is that whenever I click one of the list elements, I want to be able to actually fire off this event. So we're going to get an event and the channel name. We're going to do event prevent default on our button so we don't do any type of interactions, and then we're going to dispatch the set selected channel event with the channel name. And that's exactly like what's going to happen then is that we simply say that, hey, this event happened, this channel was selected, this is me just informing all of the other components out there in the DOM that this happened. And when we have done that, what's going to happen is that this on event function is going to be called, and we're going to reset the channel list back to its original state. There's no selected element here, and then it's going to go and check here. It's going to grab the channel name, and it's going to set the selected state with this class here, and then we're going to actually see that thing be green. Like that's how this green color is being achieved. You simply click something, and hey, it's setting it to green and white text. So this is where things differ a little bit from how I traditionally do it. So I kind of like this idea of having a template string like this, because it becomes very readable when you have traditionally I used to do this with just like document.createElement and actually have functions named in a very specific way, like based on each tag I would have like h1 and div functions and stuff like that. But I think that this makes it a little bit more readable. So I wanted to experiment with this a little bit in this little video series to see if I can make this work for me. And so far it's worked pretty well. So we have this render function that is going to render out the actual DOM structure that we want for this component, and all it is a list, and then we're going to use our string literal here basically, and we're going to loop over or map over all the channels and call this function here on each channel, and then we're going to join everything together because what we're going to be left with is just an array of different elements. So we're going to join together, and what's going to be produced is just one big string. And then that's basically it. We then call render list item, which is going to be these, like it's just going to be an object which is going to hold either that, hey, this thing is selected, and the channel name. And then we're going to return the string. And this is where data-ref comes into it. This will make more sense when we've looked at the create elements function, but hey, we need to start somewhere. So the data.ref attribute is here in order for us to be able to convert this element, this node, and grab that and actually put it on our refs object. So we actually have a reference to the actual element that gets created, because hey, this is just a string, right? But we can't just have a string, because we need a way to actually reference that element on the DOM so that we can make our updates when there's a new event. Because as you know, you may be accustomed in, say, React to having this happen for you automatically, but that's because React internally, the framework, is actually re-rendering the page for you. But now that we don't have that, we actually have to think about that ourselves. So how do we update? I mean, even if I update something or a value or something on that element, that doesn't just necessarily mean that, hey, that's magically going to be shown on the page. I actually have to think about, okay, what updates are going to happen? My state changed, but how do I actually re-render the page? And this is how you do that, by grabbing a reference to the element and resetting or updating the element directly. Cool. So then, yeah, and that's basically the base. These are the basic stylings. So we have the data-ref here, so we can grab the list element, so we can update the classes so we get the right colors, and then we have an on-click that we've declared, which is going to reference channel list.load channel, and this is where this comes in, where we saw earlier that I actually export that, where I actually put the instance on the window object. Now the reason why I do that is because of this thing here. So in order for the onClick to be able to have a reference to the function that I want to call, this has to have some type of global reference. There is no way, as far as I know, to actually have a locally scoped reference, like unless we wrap this whole thing in like some type of like a closure or something. It's not possible, as far as I know, to do this in a nicer way, and this is what usually trips up people a little bit when it comes to, you know, the global space and the global namespace in JavaScript. But this is very, like, it's not much of a problem when you have named components like this, because I'm never going to, I mean, as long as I don't have another global reference to a component that is called channel list on my window object, I'm never going to have a collision here. And in my experience, this is actually it's not the best solution, but it is a very it's a fairly safe solution. I don't think I've ever been in a project where I've ever found that the global namespace had two identical components. And if that was the case, it was very simple to simply name one of the components a little bit differently. It would have been a different story if we just had a bunch of functions, because functions are usually, they are not namespaced naturally by a component name. But this works fairly well. Cool. And then we have the direct messages, which is very similar. Like we can just kind of gloss over this. I think it's a very similar, almost identical thing that we're doing here. We have remove channel here as well, which is a little bit different. But basically all that is that you can click on this little X here. That's that interaction right there. And we're going to implement that later. And otherwise, this is pretty much the same thing. Cool. So, and then we have some basic CSS updates, nothing super, we don't have to go so deep into like every aspect of CSS. I'll just scroll through this so you can kind of look at it. And here we have our sidebar actions, which is basically, as you saw earlier, this is all it is. It's just a function that takes in a value and it's going to return an object with a type, which is going to be this set selected channels label that we have and the value. And here are our events for the sidebar, and here comes the sidebar reducer. And now remember what I said earlier. So the reducer's responsibility is to take in the state and an action and simply check what the type of the action is. And if it matches against any of these predefined cases, it's going to do the update that I want. So in this case, I just want to I just want to remember, I want to put on my state that there was a selected channel, because I'm going to need that at a later stage in order to determine which channel I should actually go to the server and grab, and so forth. So I'm just being a little bit going a little bit ahead here, but hopefully that's going to turn out well for us. And then we have some global variables that we've declared with some colors and some font sizes. And then we're going to look at that in just a moment. Yeah, and then we can actually look at the create. This is just a export function here, as we can see. We can probably just go and look here. I'm just exporting the create elements function, and we're giving it a DOM parser. So a DOM parser, which is going to make sense now pretty soon, is basically just an interface that the browser has natively that allows me to actually parse a string. I parse a document, and in this case what I want to use it for is to parse the string from the component into a document object, so that I can actually start doing like JavaScript operations on that string. And this is where it kind of differs from what I'm used to, so this is a little bit of an experiment for me as well, because usually I've only worked with having everything in JavaScript, and this is the first time I actually tried to use string literals or template strings in order to do this. But I think it's so far it's been pretty good. So here is my little higher order function that's called make create element. That's going to take in the DOM parser and return a function that expects a component, which is going to be, the channels list or whichever component we want to create. So what's going to happen now is that we are going to call the render function, and we're simply going to, well, in this case I'm actually passing in the props here. I don't have to do that because we're not actually doing that right now. So that's not really necessary. But anywho, we're going to call the render function, and we're going to set the type of the document that we want to create, a text to an HTML document basically, and we're going to get that document back. And then we're going to grab the children, and then we're going to grab all the elements that matches the selector. And the selector we're after is references and child. So we're going to go through all of these elements, and then we're going to grab the data-ref attribute, and if there is a reference, in other words, this is an element that we actually want to remember or to store on our component, then we simply add it to our component. And for children, we do a very similar thing where we basically store it on the component's child, or the children's property. And then we have this little thing here which is called replace node. So what's going to happen here is that in the future, we are going to very likely have to have these higher order components that take in some type of other component, and once you want to place it somewhere within your DOM structure. Now, in order for us to do that in an effective way, I want to use templating. So what I want to do here is that I want to be able to declare just a part of the string wherever in my component and say, hey, this is just a placeholder for another component. And could you just add that in. That's where this set child function we saw earlier came into play. So I will set a child, which is just going to be an instance of another component, and this logic here is going to actually find all the references that I have to data-child, and as long as if that matches that name that I gave to my child, it's going to switch out my template element within that string for this new component. We'll see later on in the series exactly how that works, but that's the idea here anyway. So that way I can actually say, put placeholders in my components and say, hey, I want you to switch out these components for other components, if you will. And then finally, I simply return the first child node of the body of this document, which is going to be the finished DOM element, basically. And that's about it. So that's all this function is doing, and then we have a finished element. So this, I know this was a little bit long, but since we have to introduce all these concepts, it does drag on a little bit. But we can pretty confidently say that this is right now done. So we will just have this card moved, and then we will take the next card, and we will say, look at adding a header, and that's going to come up next.